Already, as I curled up with that book by the fire, it was beginning to reciprocate and even alter my experience, while also giving me a vocabulary by which to fathom that experience, so that I would always understand that Christmas night, a night on which I relished my father's vices rather than cursing them, as a version of that final sitting-room scene, and its tacit, book-tinged intimacy, a version of Mrs. Ramsay's final triumph. A few weeks later, my parents called me from Boston. After 8 years of failed cancer treatments, they said, my father's oncologists had decided to remove his bladder altogether. My father assured me he was pleased. He hadn't been feeling well for some time, he said, and I remembered that over the holidays I had occasionally turned to see him grimacing. There was one more thing, my mother said. The surgery would mean that he could no longer drink. No longer drink. How marvelous that would be, and yet how impossible to imagine. At the time of the 12-hour operation, I was visiting Amsterdam with a group of college friends. My mother called almost hourly with updates. Dim sum, a trip to the Van Gogh Museum, and a walk through the red light district were all interrupted with medical reports. Well, they've removed the bladder completely, and they're about to build a new one from the intestine. We were watching an impeccably choreographed and oddly sterile orgy scene at a midnight live sex show when my mother called one last time to say that the surgery was over and couldn't have gone better. For weeks I had been having nightmares, but with this news I immediately lost a bit of interest. Of course it had been a success, I thought. It was this same winter that Virginia Woolf, escaping the prim ranks of women writers to which my high school teachers had consigned her, became instead the nexus of my reading life. My tutor, Shane, was a sharp, wry Beckett scholar who had taught me James Joyce earlier in the year. His comprehension of British modernism was so effortless and unsentimental that my own hard work and enthusiasm embarrassed us both. Miffed by Woolf's snarky dismissal of Joyce, a queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples, she famously called him, Shane never missed an opportunity to ridicule her snobbishness and eccentricity. On the day we were to discuss Orlando, he brought in a particularly unflattering photograph of Vida Sackville-West, her friend and paramour. How anyone could write a love letter to that is beyond me, he chortled. I enjoyed his irreverence. Certainly I needed reminding that one mustn't take literature so seriously all the time. But as I read my way through every one of Woolf's novels, my own admiration for her only intensified. It wasn't long before I began to answer Shane's questions with uncharacteristic certainty, and though I couldn't always locate the corresponding textual evidence, I never failed, as I had constantly during our Joyce tutorial, to produce the exact response for which he had been angling. He soon grew frustrated by this instinctive, unscholarly version of literary criticism, but when he told me, not at all complimentarily, that I seemed to have an intuitive sense of Woolf, I was overjoyed. 1 week after my father's operation, I was foraging for Mrs. Dalloway criticism in the depths of the Bodleian Library, a pleasure that, as Woolf acerbically recalls in A Room of One's Own, had been denied her as a woman some 70 years earlier. My mother called again. My father was fine, she said, but he had reacted badly when they tried to switch him from a feeding tube to solid food. When she called the following day, it was to say that he was actually suffering from delirium tremens, or alcohol withdrawal. The previous evening, he had started to complain of a terrible smell, then to frantically wave away the hundreds of tiny gnats he saw swarming the hospital room. Neither my mother nor the doctors smelled or saw anything unusual. Within hours, he had become incoherent, hostile, and violent. He shouted at